Hello, my name is David Biale, and I'm a co-editor of the Jewish Studies series at Stanford University Press. I'm here with Julia Elsky, whose recently published book in our series is called Writing Occupation, Jewish Émigré Voices in Wartime France. So Julia, can you tell us what we learned by studying these particular group of authors, some of them better known like Irene Nemirovsky, others less known. What do we learn?
Yeah, so in this book, I study Eastern European Jewish immigrant authors who came to France in the 1920s and adopted French as their literary language. And I follow their experience of the war when they were moving between adopted and native languages during the occupation of France from 1940 to 1944. And they did so at a time when they were forced to rethink their positions as Jews, as immigrants, and as writers in France. And so I show in this book how they changed their approaches to writing in French during the war as they faced a double exclusion as foreigners and as Jews. And through their writing in French, we see how they were rethinking religious, cultural, and linguistic identities. For example, some writers began to write about Jewishness during the war, and others began to write kind of multilingual texts in which they incorporated Hebrew letters or Hebrew prayer or Yiddish words or Yiddish accents into their texts. And I try to show that by doing this with the French language, they are contesting the boundaries between French and foreign, center and periphery, between Jewish and non-Jewish languages. And they were showing how French is not a monolingual language that's closed off to Jewish voice. And so I try to show in Writing Occupation that these Jewish immigrant writers in the war introduced the possibility of French as a Jewish language, expanding the question, what is a Jewish language? And they were doing it, in one of the most terrible moments for Jews in French history, or the worst moment for Jews in French history. And I want to show in this book that rather than silencing Jewish voice, the war presents a crucial moment during which Jewish authors in France reconsidered their positions in France and through writing in French.
So, yeah, that's great. So, I'm very struck by the fact that a number of the books that we're publishing right now in our series take on these kind of questions. That is, not specifically French, not specifically the period of the war, but the question of what is a Jewish language and how modern European languages, such as German, French, English, are turned into Jewish languages by writers. So it seems like a number of people working independently have come to this question, which expands our knowledge of our sense of what it means to be Jewish in the modern world. In what language do you express yourself?
Right, exactly. I became really interested in questions of bilingualism, multilingualism, immigrant identities, especially, coming at this project as someone who's a scholar of French literature. And so when you put together these questions of Francophonie and the adoption of French, from this perspective, I'm thinking about Francophonie as European Jewish Francophonie. That's one of my ideas in my book. And then thinking about Jewish bilingualism, when you put it together, sometimes these writers are not writing what we think of as Jewish bilingualism, Yiddish and Hebrew, but are writing French and Yiddish or French and Hebrew, and that this is as much a kind of Jewish bilingualism.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you a brief sort of personal question. How did you decide to take on this topic?
I became really interested in the writer Irene Nemirovsky a long time ago. Well, not that long ago, but in the early 2000s when her writing was being rediscovered. She was an important novelist in the interwar period who had been forgotten. And in the early 2000s, her greatest novel, I think, which was written during the war, was discovered and published in a kind of fantastic story of how it was discovered, and became a bestseller. And then I got interested in reading her interwar writing, which had very poignant and painful depictions of rejection in France. And so I began to seek out what other Jewish writers were writing about in this time. And I began to see how many texts were being written or rewritten in some cases under the occupation by Jewish writers, and texts that really do engage with the questions of Jewishness, language, Frenchness during the war. And so in writing Occupation, I try to uncover the voices of these writers, some of whom have been forgotten today, to show that they didn't stop thinking about Jewishness during the war. They didn't stop thinking about what their place was in France, and they weren't silenced.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And let me wish you best of luck with this really important and fascinating study.
Thank you so much.